I can still remember the exact moment the words first slipped out of her mouth. The way her lips trembled ever so slightly when she said them. It was a rainy Thursday night in late September of 2019. The kind where the air outside smelled like wet concrete and decaying leaves, and the sound of rain against the window felt like a metronome ticking away the last beats of something fragile. We were sitting on the old beige couch in our apartment, the one we bought secondhand off Craigslist back in 2016 when we first moved in together. She was quiet that night, unusually quiet. But then again, silence had become her favorite weapon lately. She turned to me, eyes glossed over, and said almost in a whisper, "You deserve better." I laughed at first. It was that awkward, hollow kind of laugh you let out when you think someone is trying to comfort you but you don't quite get the punchline. I thought she meant it in the way people usually do. That I deserved a better job, a better shot at happiness, a better break in life. After all, things had been rough lately. The company I worked for had just gone through massive layoffs after the pandemic pushed us into remote limbo, and although I was spared, my hours had been cut. I was tired all the time, mentally foggy, like someone had dimmed the lights on my brain. But the way she said it, it lingered in the air. Heavy. Almost final. It wasn't until much later that I realized she didn't mean I deserved better in life. She meant I deserved better than her. She was already halfway gone when she said those words. Her heart somewhere else. Maybe even with someone else. And me? I was too blind, too hopeful, maybe too scared to notice. Looking back, I should have known. I should have seen the cracks forming long before the dam broke. But when you're in love, or at least when you believe you are, you start convincing yourself that the silence is just comfort, that the distance is just stress, that the way her phone lit up at midnight with work messages was just the new normal in a world where everyone is always. You make excuses, not because you don't know the truth, but because you're terrified of what the truth will take from you. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up. My name's Daniel Harper, and if you asked anyone who's known me since childhood, they'd probably describe me as the dependable one. The guy who never skipped out on a promise, who stayed late to help friends move furniture, who showed up at every funeral and wedding with a firm handshake and a card tucked in his jacket pocket. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, in a modest 2-story house on a street where neighbors still waved when you drove by. My parents, Ruth and Michael, raised me and my younger sister Emily on meatloaf dinners and Sunday church. My dad worked at a tire plant until his back gave out, and my mom stitched clothes at home to make ends meet. We weren't rich, but we weren't miserable either. Life was simple back then. Almost painfully. Summers meant baseball in the park, winters meant snow forts and hot chocolate, and in high school, I was the kid who blended in decent grades, decent looks, nothing flashy. I wasn't the guy the girls swooned over, but I wasn't invisible either. I lived in that middle ground, that gray area where you're good enough but never extraordinary. And maybe that's why when Rachel came into my life, I thought I'd finally stumbled into something extraordinary. I met Rachel in 2013 during a 4th of July barbecue at a mutual friend's place. She was standing by the grill in a red sundress, laughing at some dumb joke someone made about fireworks. The way she laughed, it wasn't polite or restrained. It was full-bodied, the kind of laugh that made heads turn because it was so unapologetically real. I was drawn to it like a moth to a flame. We talked that night about everything from movies to our childhood pets, and when she casually mentioned she was teaching art at a local elementary school, I remember thinking, of course she's the kind of person who colors the world for kids who can barely color inside the lines. We started dating soon after, and for a while it felt like the universe had finally stopped playing tricks on me. We went to concerts at the Newport Music Hall, ate late-night tacos at Condado, and binge-watched Game of Thrones back when everyone still believed the ending would be worth it. She had this way of making even the most ordinary moments feel cinematic. Like when she'd steal fries off my plate and then grin like a thief caught red-handed. Or when she'd hum along to the Lumineers on road trips, slightly off-key but perfect in her own way. By 2016 we moved into that small apartment with the beige couch and the cracked kitchen tiles. It wasn't much, but it was ours. I proposed to her in 2018 on a chilly evening in December, right in front of the big Christmas tree downtown. She cried, I cried. Strangers clapped. It was like something out of a Hallmark movie. And for a while I believed that was it. I believed we'd written the first chapter of a love story that would last a lifetime. But life has a funny way of sneaking in the fine print, the clauses you don't read until it's too late. By early 2019, things started to shift. At first it was subtle, Rachel picked up more after-school projects that kept her out later than usual. She seemed glued to her phone, tilting the screen away when I walked by. She stopped reaching for my hand on the couch, stopped humming in the shower, stopped looking at me with that spark in her eyes that once made me feel like the only person in the room. I told myself it was teaching isn't easy, especially in a public school system stretched too thin. I figured she was tired, overworked, maybe even burnt out. And then there was me, tired too from dragging myself through endless spreadsheets and Zoom meetings, trying to pretend like cutting my hours in half didn't feel like cutting my worth in half too. We were both sinking, and instead of reaching for each other, we just let ourselves drift apart. There was one night, June 12, 2019, that should have been my wake-up call. I came home earlier than expected, the office closing after yet another cost-cutting meeting, and I found Rachel sitting at the dining table. Her laptop was open and she was typing furious. When she noticed me, she slammed it shut so quickly that the sound echoed in the room. She smiled too brightly and asked about my day. I should have asked then. I should have demanded to know who she was talking to, what she was hiding. But instead I told myself it was lesson plans, or maybe just some personal journal. I didn't want to believe it could be anything else. And then came that rainy night in September, when she said those words, "You deserve better." It felt like a crack of thunder had gone off inside me, but I brushed it off, not realizing that thunder always comes after lightning. And somewhere in the shadows of our life, the storm was already raging. I think about that night often, about the way the rain tapped against the glass like it was trying to warn me, like it was trying to say, "Listen, pay attention, something is breaking." But I didn't. I turned up the volume on the TV, pretended everything was fine, and let the storm roll close. The day the truth finally broke through started out deceptively ordinary. It was October. I remember because the leaves outside were starting to turn into that perfect postcard mix of oranges and reds, the kind that makes you think of pumpkin spice lattes and college football weekend. I was working from home that morning, perched on the kitchen table with my laptop, trying to make sense of another spreadsheet that looked more like gibberish than numbers. Rachel had already left for work, a quick kiss on the cheek, her perfume trailing faintly after her as she walked out the door. I tried not to overthink how rushed she'd been, how her eyes darted toward the clock instead of toward me. That had become normal, her always in a hurry, me always pretending not to notice. Around noon I decided to take a break and do some cleaning. It was one of those small acts of control I clung to, as if wiping down counters could somehow wipe away the unease building in my gut. I picked up her hoodie draped over the back of the couch, and absent-mindedly reached into the pocket, intending to toss a crumpled receipt or gum wrapper into the trash. What I pulled out instead was a folded slip of paper, soft from being handled too often. It was a note, a short written in a man's handwriting. "Last night was incredible. I don't know how much longer we can keep sneaking around like this, but I'll take every second I can get. I'll see you Sunday. M." My heart didn't just sink, it detonated. My hands trembled so violently I nearly dropped them. I stood there frozen, staring at the paper like it might burst into flames if I blinked. For a moment my brain refused to process it, twisting the words into something innocent. Maybe it was from one of her students' parents, maybe M was a friend. But no matter how much I tried to rewrite it in my head, the words screamed what they were: proof. Proof that when she said I deserved better she'd already chosen someone else. I felt nauseous, like the room was spinning and my stomach was trying to crawl out of my body. I sat down on the couch, gripping the note so hard it crumpled, and I kept thinking, this can't be real, not Rachel, not her. I don't know how long I sat there. Minutes, maybe hours. My laptop pinged with an email from work, but it felt like it was coming from another dimension. All I could hear was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, each second dragging me further into a reality I didn't want. Eventually I forced myself to move. I paced the living room, the note still in my hand, reading it over and over until the words blurred. Every time I reached last night, I felt a punch in my chest, like I'd been sucker punched by the very person I trusted most. I debated calling her right then, demanding answers, but fear rooted me in place. Fear of what she might fear that once I asked the question, I could never go back to pretending everything was fine. So I did nothing. I tucked the note back where I found it, like some coward hoping that if I ignored it, the truth would stay folded away too. That night, she came home later than usual. She smelled faintly of cologne, one that wasn't hers, and my stomach twisted. She dropped her bag by the door, smiled at me in that strained, brittle way she'd perfected, and asked how my day was. I remember mumbling something about work and forcing a smile. Meanwhile, my insides screamed. I studied her face for signs. Was there guilt in her eyes? Shame in the way she avoided mine? Or was it all in my head? The weekend came, and Sunday loomed like a thundercloud. I didn't tell her I knew about the note. Instead, I became hyper-aware of everything. Her shower lasting longer than usual. Her makeup a little heavier. Her clothes chosen with more care. When she said she was meeting some friends for brunch, my chest burned with the weight of the I watched her walk out the door, knowing full well M was waiting for her somewhere. I think that's when something inside me broke, not cleanly like a snapped twig, but jagged, like glass shattering into a million shards you'll keep finding months later. I couldn't sit still. I grabbed my keys, got into my car and started driving aimlessly, heart pounding so hard I thought it might break my ribs. My hands shook on the wheel as I debated whether to follow her. I told myself it was insane, but insanity already felt like the only language. I ended up parking a few blocks from a cafe downtown, the kind of trendy spot with Edison bulbs and avocado toast that Rachel loved. And there she was, sitting at a table near the window, and across from her, a mid-30s maybe, clean-shaven, tall, with that self-assured look of someone who had never been the dependable, invisible kid in high school. Their hands brushed across the table, casual but charged, and the sight made my vision tunnel. It was him, M, whoever the hell he was. I wanted to storm in there, flip the table, demand answers, but I didn't. I sat in my car, watching them laugh, watching her lean in like she used to lean into me, watching a version of Rachel I hadn't seen in months, and realizing she hadn't disappeared. She'd just given it to someone else. The rage came in waves, crashing hard, leaving me breathless. But underneath it was something worse, humiliation. The kind that eats at you, makes you question every memory, every moment. Was our whole relationship a lie? Had she been thinking of him the last time she kissed me? The last time she whispered goodnight? I drove home before she saw me. The walls of the apartment closed in on me, suffocating, every corner of it stained with the weight of her betrayal. I opened a bottle of whiskey we'd been saving for our anniversary, poured it into a glass, and downed it in one swallow. The burn felt like punishment, but not enough. Nothing felt like enough. When she came home hours later, cheeks flushed, eyes sparkling, I played along. I asked how brunch was, and she said it was good. She talked about mimosas, and pancakes, and I nodded like a fool, the note still folded in my pocket, burning a hole straight through me. That night, as she slept beside me, her breathing slow and steady, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The room smelled faintly of her shampoo, and it made me sick. I kept replaying every word, every look, every red flag I'd ignored. I thought about how she once told me I was her forever. I thought about the Christmas proposal, the clapping strangers, the ring that now felt like a joke. And I thought about those words again. You deserve better. Now I finally understood. She hadn't meant it as comfort, she meant it as her escape route. It was the breaking point. The moment the world I'd built with her collapsed into rubble, leaving me standing there with nothing but a crumpled note, a hollow chest, and a truth too ugly to ignore. The weeks after I found that note blurred together into a haze of numbness and quiet breakdown. On the surface, life went on. Alarm clocks still rang at 7 a.m. Traffic lights still flickered red and green on High Street. People at work still made small talk about the Buckeyes and the weather. But inside I felt like I was unraveling thread by thread, and no one could see it, because I kept shoving the frayed edges into my pockets. I didn't tell Rachel I knew, not right away. I could. Confronting her felt like walking into a war zone without armor, and I wasn't ready for the explosion. Instead I carried the truth silently, like a shard of glass lodged in my chest, cutting deeper every time I tried to breathe normally. At work I was a ghost. I'd stare at spreadsheets until the numbers bled into each other, my head pounding with questions I couldn't shut off. Who was M? How long had it been going on? Was I really so blind that I hadn't noticed the woman I loved had been slipping away piece by piece? I'd sit in Zoom meetings with my camera off, nodding when someone asked me something, while in reality my mind was replaying that scene at the cafe like a cruel loop. Her laugh, his hand brushing hers, the betrayal playing out in broad daylight. Sleep became a strange. Nights stretched long and jagged, my mind buzzing like a neon sign that wouldn't shut off. I'd lie there in the dark, Rachel's steady breathing beside me, and imagine her body pressed against his instead of mine. Sometimes the anger boiled so hot I had to get up, pacing the apartment barefoot, my fists clenched. Other times it wasn't anger but despair, this suffocating weight in my chest that made me bury my face in my pillow and cry quietly so she wouldn't hear. I started drinking. At first it was just a beer or two after work, But soon the fridge was stocked with six-packs, and bottles of whiskey started disappearing faster than I could remember opening them. Alcohol dulled the edges, blurred the questions, made the silence bearable, but it also made me reckless. I'd scroll through Rachel's phone when she was in the shower, my hands shaking as I searched for proof I already had. Deleted texts, mysterious late-night calls, sometimes I'd find fragments, half a message, an unsaved number, but mostly it was absence, which somehow hurt worse. The absence told me she was careful, too careful, careful enough to protect him, not me. It wasn't just the nights or the work, it was everything. Food lost its taste, music sounded hollow, even little things, like walking past the park where we once picnicked, or seeing her red dress still hanging in the closet, felt like knives twisting in me. I started pulling away from people too. My sister Emily called one night, asking if I wanted to come over for dinner. I made up an excuse about deadlines. She pressed, sensing something was off, but I deflected. I couldn't tell her, I couldn't tell anyone, because once the words left my mouth, it would be real, undeniable, irreversible, and a part of me still clung to denial, like a drowning man clutching driftwood. The truth is, I was ashamed that I hadn't seen it sooner, ashamed that I was still sleeping beside her, pretending, playing along, ashamed that the dependable guy, the one everyone counted on, couldn't even hold his own life together. Rachel, for her part, acted like nothing was wrong. She smiled at me, kissed me goodbye, asked about my day. She still cooked pasta on Tuesdays, still left sticky notes on the fridge, reminding me to buy milk, and that her normalcy was almost worse than the affair itself, because it made me question my sanity. Was I imagining it? Had I misread the note, misinterpreted the cafe? Was I paranoid, insecure, projecting my own fears? But then I'd catch her smiling at her phone, or watch her lock it quickly when I walked into the room, and the doubt evaporated. I wasn't crazy, I was betrayed. There was one night, I think it was October 21st, when the facade we were watching Netflix, some forgettable series neither of us really cared about, and her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She glanced at it, her face lighting up with a smile she didn't even try to hide. Then she grabbed the phone and stood up, walking into the bedroom to answer. I sat there on the couch, my body frozen, my mind screaming. I could hear her muffled voice through the wall, soft and intimate in a way she hadn't been with me in months. I wanted to rip the phone out of her hands, to scream, to demand she admit, but instead I sat in silence, the glow of the TV painting my face, my fists clenched so tight, my nails dug into my palms. When she came back out, her expression was smooth again, like nothing had happened. She curled up next to me, resting her head on my shoulder, and I wanted to shove her off, to tell her I knew, but I didn't. I let her stay there because the alternative, facing the truth head-on, still felt too big, too terrifying. That night, after she fell asleep, I went into the bathroom and stared at myself in the mirror. My face looked older, hollowed out, my eyes were bloodshot, my jaw clenched. I barely recognized the man staring back at me. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about Rachel anymore, it was about me, about what I was allowing, about how much I was willing to shrink just to avoid being alone. The fallout seeped into every corner of my life. Friends noticed. At a buddy's birthday party in early November, someone joked that I looked like I hadn't slept in weeks. I laughed it off, but the truth was written all over me. I was unraveling, and everyone could see it except the one person who should have cared most. Or maybe she saw it too, and just didn't care anymore. Even holidays were poisoned. Thanksgiving came and Rachel insisted we go to her parents' house. I sat at their table, surrounded by people who thought we were the perfect couple, who asked when the wedding planning was starting, and I smiled and lied through my teeth while the truth sat like acid in my stomach. I wanted to scream, to flip the table, to tell them their daughter was breaking me in ways they couldn't imagine, but I didn't. I carved turkey, passed the mashed potatoes, and swallowed the bitterness like it was gravy. The breaking point had already happened, but the fallout, that slow, steady erosion, was somehow worse, because it wasn't one big explosion you could point to. It was death by 1,000 cuts, each day another slice into whatever love, trust, and dignity I had left. And yet, through all of it, I stayed because I didn't know how to leave. I stayed because the thought of starting over at 31, of walking away from 6 years of memories, terrified me. I stayed because some foolish, desperate part of me hoped maybe she'd come back. Maybe she'd realize what she was risking. Maybe love was enough to fix what had already shattered. But deep down I knew the Rachel I loved was gone. And the worst part was, she hadn't just left. She'd handed herself to someone else, piece by piece, while I sat there convincing myself I was still whole. The morning I decided I couldn't stay trapped in that apartment any longer. Something inside me shifted. It wasn't sudden like flipping a switch, but quiet, almost imperceptible at first. I woke up one chilly November day, the sunlight slanting through the blinds and cutting lines across the beige couch, and I realized I had two choices: continue being a ghost in my own life, or start taking it back. I started small. First, I refused to hide anymore. I stopped pretending everything was fine when Rachel smiled at me. I stopped laughing at her jokes that didn't reach her eyes. I stopped pretending I wasn't aware of the betrayal. It was subtle, but it made a difference. She noticed it too. Of course, there was a shift in her posture, a tension in her smiles. I'd catch her watching me in the corner of her eye, calculating, and I realized that for the first time in months, I wasn't the one who felt powerless. I started to reclaim parts of my life I'd abandoned. I went back to the gym, running at dawn when the streets were empty and the cold air burned my lungs. I signed up for a weekend pottery class I'd always wanted to try, and it felt liberating to create something with my hands, to mold clay and see it transform under my own control. I even reconnected with old friends, inviting them over for poker nights and beer, sharing laughs that had been absent for months. Each small victory reminded me that I was more than the betrayal that had defined the last few weeks. And yet, I couldn't ignore her completely. There was still the matter of Rachel and her M. The thought of confronting her loomed in the back of my mind, heavy and unrelenting. But this time, I approached it with strategy instead of blind desperation. I collected proof, not because I wanted to shame her publicly, but because I needed to feel a sense of justice, a sense of truth solidified somewhere outside my own tortured memory. Screenshots, missed calls, snippets of message. Each piece was like a brick, slowly constructing a wall I could stand behind instead of crumbling against. By early December I felt ready. I asked her to sit down, and for the first time in months, I looked her in the eye without fear. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I simply laid it out. The note, the cafe, the messages, the truth. And I watched as her composure faltered. Her carefully maintained mask slipped, if only for a second. It wasn't revenge I felt in that moment. Not really. It was power. Real, grounded power. The power of someone who had been hurt too deeply to remain silent, who refused to let her deceit define the rest of his life. She tried to explain, tried to rationalize, tried to claim it was a mistake, that she was confused, that we were struggling, that it wasn't about me. But I realized then that explanations didn't matter anymore. The story had been written, and her chapter with me had ended. I moved out a few days later. I packed my things into boxes, carrying memories I wasn't ready to discard yet. Photographs, small mementos, ticket stubs from concerts we'd attended together. The apartment that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a museum of betrayal. Walking away wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Each step toward the door was a reclaiming of my dignity, my sanity, my life. Once I was out, I threw myself into rebuilding. Work became my anchor. I volunteered for extra projects, threw myself into deadlines, and even took a small promotion that required traveling to other cities. The physical movement, the immersion in something outside of myself, helped dull the ache. I started running long distances, pushing my body to exhaustion so my mind couldn't wander. The first time I ran 10 miles without stopping, I felt a kind of freedom I hadn't experienced in years. A sense that I could endure pain, confront hardship, and still come out standing. Socially, I began to redefine myself. I didn't rush into dating. Not yet. But I started reconnecting with people I had neglected. Coffee dates with friends, late-night drives with Emily, where we talked about everything from family drama to her new job. Casual brunches with coworkers who became more than just faces on Zoom. Slowly, I rebuilt a life that wasn't centered on her. A life that didn't carry the weight of her choices on my shoulders. And then came the moment I realized the shift wasn't just external. It was internal. I felt anger. Yes. But it wasn't the destructive, paralyzing rage of the months prior. It was controlled, tempered, and almost detached. I no longer obsessed over what she had done or who she was with. I no longer let myself spiral into nights of despair. I was reclaiming myself, reclaiming my narrative, and that sense of control was intoxicating. Yet, there were moments of doubt, Moments when the past clawed back in subtle, insidious ways. I'd hear a song we once loved, and for a heartbeat the memories would crash over me. I'd pass a cafe like the one downtown and feel my chest. The moral conflict gnawed at me. Was I healing? Or was I building walls so high I could never love again? Was my pursuit of justice and reclamation turning me into someone colder? Someone wary of intimacy? I confronted those moments the same way I confronted her betrayal. With awareness and choice, I allowed myself to feel, to grieve. But I refused to be paralyzed. I journaled relentlessly, writing down thoughts I couldn't speak aloud, imagining conversations that could never happen. I wrote about the pain, the anger, the humiliation, and also about the small victories, the morning runs, the laughter with friends, the quiet pride in building something of my own again. By January 2020 I was functioning at a level I hadn't experienced in months. I'd taken up photography, capturing the city in early morning fogs and late evening gold light. I traveled to Chicago for a work conference, and stayed a few extra days just to wander, exploring neighborhoods I had never seen, taking in the architecture, the smells, the sounds of a city that didn't know my heartbreak. Every shutter click felt like reclaiming a piece of my life, a visual reminder that the world was bigger than the betrayal I had endured. And then inevitably, I ran in. I was grabbing a coffee near my apartment when she walked in, smiling, looking effortlessly put together, the same spark in her eyes she once reserved for me. My first instinct was shock, maybe even rage, but instead I simply smiled. Politely, casually. I didn't say a word about the past. I didn't accuse, I just observed her like a chapter I had already finished reading. The encounter was brief, a collision of worlds that no longer overlapped. She didn't approach me, didn't attempt to reconnect, and in that moment, I realized something profound. The power had shifted completely. I wasn't the one left reeling, twisted in agony. I wasn't the one haunted by the choices of the other. I had walked away, rebuilt, reclaimed, and she was a reminder of what I had survived, not a presence controlling my life. The moral conflict lingered, of course. There were times when I caught myself imagining retribution, imagining exposing her publicly or making her regret it. But those thoughts were fleeting. I realized revenge is just a cage. Liberation comes not from punishing others, but from freeing yourself. Every act of reclamation, every choice to heal rather than lash out, became my revenge. Not on her but on the version of myself that had been broken. By the spring of 2020 I had started dating again. Not seriously. Not yet. But enough to remind myself that connection was still possible. I met someone at a gallery opening. A woman named Claire. She was kind, witty, and grounded. And she didn't carry the shadows of past betrayal. With her I laughed easily. With her I could enjoy the small moments without fear. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the weight of Rachel's betrayal loosened, leaving me lighter, more myself than I had been in months. The turning point, the reclaiming of my life, wasn't a single event. It was a series of decisions, small and cumulative, that reminded me who I was and what I was capable of. The heartbreak didn't vanish, but it became a fuel rather than a shackle. And for the first time in a long time, I realized that the world hadn't ended with her betrayal. It had expanded. I had expanded. By the time summer rolled around in 2020, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. The world doesn't pause for heartbreak. It doesn't wait for us to pick up the pieces. Life just keeps moving. Relentless, indifferent. And in that motion I found my freedom. I had moved into a small apartment a few blocks from the downtown area. It was modest. Brick walls, a tiny balcony overlooking the street, and just enough space to breathe without feeling crowded. I decorated it with plants, string lights, and photographs I'd taken over the past month. Every corner reminded me that I had rebuilt my life on my terms. Every plant that had survived my sometimes clumsy care, every picture that captured a fleeting moment of beauty, was a symbol of resilience. Claire and I had started seeing each other more seriously by then. Our connection was simple, grounded, and honest. No secrets, no whispers behind closed doors, no stolen glances at someone else's texts. I realized the contrast between her and Rachel wasn't just in loyalty. It was in presence. Claire was present, fully, and I had never appreciated presence as much as I did now. It wasn't about infatuation. It was about stability, about trust, about being seen without fear. I think back to that night in September 2019. The night she said I deserved better. And it still hurt. But it doesn't control me anymore. The pain exists. Yes. Like a scar you can trace with your fingers. A reminder that you survived. But it's not sharp anymore. It's just there. Quiet. A shadow that doesn't define the room. I realized that the lesson wasn't about her betrayal. It was about me. About understanding that my worth wasn't tied to anyone else's choices. About learning that love, as powerful as it can be, doesn't have to be destructive. And that sometimes the very thing that tears you apart is what pushes you into becoming stronger, more resilient, more yourself. There were moments when I thought of confronting her again. Perhaps for closure. Or maybe just to assert that I had moved on. But I never did, because closure isn't given. It's claimed quietly. In the decisions we make for ourselves, I had claimed I no longer needed a scene, a confession, a fight. I had peace, and peace is heavier than revenge, stronger than anger, and infinitely more satisfying than the empty victory of exposing someone's lies. In the fall of 2020, I traveled to New York City for a photography exhibition. Walking down the streets of Manhattan, the air crisp and alive, I noticed the little details that used to pass me by. The laughter of strangers, the rhythm of taxi horns, the way the light hit the brick of old buildings. For a fleeting moment, I thought of her, Rachel, and instead of pain I felt gratitude. Not for what she did, not for the betrayal itself, but for the growth it forced in me. I had been pushed to the edge. Yes. But I had survived. Rebuilt and transformed. She had taken from me. But she had also inadvertently given me something far more valuable. Myself. I didn't write her a letter. I didn't send screenshots to her friends, or post about the ordeal online. I didn't need to. The resolution wasn't about proving anything to her, or the world. The resolution was quiet, internal. It was in the way I could look at myself in the mirror without flinching. It was in the laughter that came easily again. In the late-night conversations with Emily that were once too painful to hold. It was in the photography I pursued with passion. In the relationships I nurtured. In the freedom I felt to make choices without fear of betrayal. Lurking in the shadows. And then one evening in early December, Claire and I were walking along the riverfront, near the city park. The sky was a deep indigo, streaked with orange and purple. The air crisp and scented faintly of winter approaching. We paused on a bridge, leaning against the railing, watching the water move fast and relentless below. She squeezed my hand gently, and in that moment, I realized I could fully let go of the past. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the sleepless nights. They were all part of the journey, but they didn't own me anymore. I understood then that life is messy, unpredictable, and sometimes cruel. People you trust can hurt you in ways that feel unbearable. And yet those same moments can teach you resilience, self-worth, and the capacity for a deeper, more authentic connection. I had learned the hard way that love without honesty is not love at all. But I had also learned that survival isn't passive. It's deliberate. It's choosing to stand up when the world has knocked you down. Choosing to rebuild. Choosing to love again despite the risk. By the time we returned home that night, I felt a lightness I hadn't known in over a year. My apartment smelled faintly of coffee and pine from a small candle on the windowsill. Claire was in the kitchen, humming as she prepared tea. I stood there for a moment, listening, breathing, feeling fully present for the first time in what felt like forever. I realized that Claire wasn't a replacement. She was a companion for a new chapter, one I had fought for, earned, and embraced. I thought about Rachel one last time. Not with anger, not with longing, but with clarity. She had been a part of my life, a catalyst for both heartbreak and transformation. And I forgave her, not because she deserved it, but because I deserved peace. Holding on to bitterness would have chained me to the past, indefinitely. Letting go allowed me to move forward, to create, to love, and to exist fully in the present. Life didn't become perfect. There were still difficult days, moments of self-doubt, reminders of what I had lost. But those moments were tempered by the knowledge that I had survived, that I had reclaimed my narrative, that I was no longer defined by the choices of someone else. I had grown, matured, and learned the most important lesson. That the person I need to prove myself to most is the last thing I want to share. The final reflection before this chapter closes is this: betrayal is devastating, and heartbreak can feel infinite. But the human heart is resilient. It adapts. It heals. And when you give yourself the grace to survive, to rebuild and to reclaim your life, you discover a strength you never knew you had. You learn that the ending you feared is not the ending at all. It's a beginning. And as I sit now watching the city lights flicker against the night sky, Claire's laughter in the next room, my camera bag resting by the door, I realize I am whole again. I have faced the storm, survived it, and emerged not bitter, not broken, but stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever comes next. I finally understand what she meant when she said I deserved better. She didn't mean someone else. She meant that life, in its unpredictable and sometimes cruel way, had something better waiting for me if I had the courage to claim it. And now I